إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. So now we are on to the fourth and final part of the book Kashf ash-Shubuhât by Muhammad ibn Abdil-Wahhab. And so this is the fourth and final, as we said, and that means that the first part of the book was the introduction. The second was a general mentioning of a refutation against the misconceptions that people use to justify shirk, and there were 9 of those, and then so we mentioned them in general, and then there was also a specific or a more detailed refutation of those misconceptions. The third part of the book was the evidences that the people use themselves, and there were a number of evidences that they use. So the first was the hadith of Usama radiallahu anhu, also the hadith of Umar. So the hadith of Usama was the one where the Prophet ﷺ rebuked him for killing a person after he said La ilaha illallah, and the hadith of Umar is the hadith of saying, or I was ordered to fight the people until they say La ilaha illallah, and then the hadith of the shafa'ah, or the intercession, in which the people will ask the prophets to intercede on their behalf on the Day of Judgment. And the last evidence that they used was the story of Jibreel with the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salatu wassalam, and how, or the evidence, or what they claim is that Ibrahim alayhi salatu wassalam, when he was placed in the fire, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent Jibreel to ask him if he had any need, and then Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam said, as for from you, then no. So they say that this is evidence that seeking help from the creation isn't shirk, because Jibreel alayhi salatu wasalam offered Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam the opportunity to receive help from him. So had it been shirk, he wouldn't have offered it to him. So these were the three the 3 parts of the book that the author, or how he divided it in, and now we're in the 4th part. And this 4th part is kind of a summary of the importance and some of the importance of Tawheed, and some of the matters that relate to it, specifically with regards to Îmân, or Musamma al-Îmân, or the reality of Îmân and kufr, as well as the importance of actions with regards to Tawheed, and the requirement of actions of the body and actions of the heart in order for a person to be Muslim. So we can entitle this 4th part as being the ruling of the person who leaves acting upon Tawheed while he has the ability to do so, while using these false arguments or false excuses. So the author here will discuss the evidences for the obligation of actions and how they're required for Tawheed, as well as a refutation of some of the false arguments that people use to justify or to say that it isn't required. And we say here, we put the caveat that the person needs to be able. So meaning if the person is unable to act for whatever reason, then there's an excuse there. Otherwise, if there's no excuse, or the ability is there, then if the ability is there, then there would be no excuse. So just to add to this as well would be that if the person is compelled or coerced, then this would be an excuse, and we'll get into it in more detail later on. But it would be an excuse with regards to what takes place on the tongue as well as what takes place on the body. But if we're talking about what takes place in the heart, whether it's the statements of the heart or the actions of the heart, which we'll get into later, then there's no excuse in this whatsoever. So now we'll just move on to what the author himself says. So he says, let us conclude this book by mentioning an important matter that will clarify what has previously been said. So as we said, this is kind of a summary. So he says, we will discuss it separately because of its importance and because many people fail to understand it correctly. So we say there is no difference of opinion that Tawheed must exist and be manifested with the heart, the tongue, and the deeds, or the outer deeds. And if one of these matters is missing, a person will not be Muslim. So if a person knows Tawheed but does not act upon it, then he is an arrogant disbeliever. So meaning he's arrogant because he knows of it, but he doesn't do it. He says, as was the case with the likes of Fir'aun and Iblis and others like them. And this is a matter that many people misunderstand. They say, this matter of what you have explained is true, and we fully understand it, and we testify to its correctness. However, we are not able to do it and to put it into practice. And it is not allowed by our countrymen to act upon these matters unless it agrees with them and their beliefs and their customs, and they give other excuses so that they do not act upon the correct beliefs. So then he continues and says, however, such a wretched person does not realize that most of the leaders of falsehood know the truth, and they only leave acting upon it due to some excuse. As Allah mentions, وَاشْتَرَوْا بِآيَاتِ اللَّهِ ثَمَنًا قَلِيلًا, or that they purchased with the signs of Allah a miserable price. And that's from Surah At-Tawbah, verse 9. And then he says, other verses also explain this point, such as when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so this verse is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was speaking about the Yahud, when they were waiting for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to emerge, or to be sent. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said about them, يَعْرِفُونَهُ كَمَا يَعْرِفُونَ أَبْنَاءَهُم, or they recognize him just as they recognize their own sons. And that's from Surah Al-Baqarah 146. So here he gives evidences, or these two evidences, to show that in these situations about these disbelievers, their disbelief wasn't due to a lack of knowledge, or wasn't due to them rejecting something actually being from the truth. It was because they didn't act upon it. Then he continues and says, now, if he acts upon Tawheed with his outward actions, while he does not understand nor believe in his heart, then he is a hypocrite who is more evil than the pure disbeliever. As Allah says, إِنَّ الْمُنَافِقِينَ فِي الدَّرْكِ الْأَسْفَلِ مِنَ النَّارِ, or that indeed the hypocrites or the munafiqeen are in the lowest depths of the hellfire. And that's from Surah An-Nisa, verse 145. And then he continues and says, and this is a prolonged matter to discuss. However, if you ponder over it, two categories of people will become clear to you in your discussions with them. You will see one who knows the truth but leaves acting upon it for fear of some loss in this world, such as his prestige or property, and you will also see one who outwardly acts upon the truth but not inwardly. If you were to ask him what he truly believes in his heart, he would not know. But upon you is to understand two verses from the Book of Allah. The first of them has already been mentioned, and it is the verse, لا تعتذروا قد كفرتم بعد إيمانكم, or do not give excuses, you have disbelieved after your faith. And that's from Surah At-Tawbah 66. And then he says, so if it is confirmed that some of the companions who actually fought with the Prophet ﷺ against the Romans disbelieved because of a statement they made jokingly, and then it will become clear to you that a person who makes a statement of disbelief or acts upon it because of fear of loss or money, prestige, and so on, or order to please one greater than he, is greater in sin than the one who says such a statement in jest. So he's saying here that we have evidence in the Quran that people made statements of disbelief that they didn't believe in their heart, but they only did so out of joking. So if this is the case with someone who said so out of joking, then what would we say about someone who does so because they fear a loss of their money or their status or something like this? Obviously, someone who says so joking would be at a lower level of danger, or wouldn't be as bad as someone who says so out of fear of wealth and so on, loss of wealth and so on. Then he goes on and he says, so he's still talking about the two verses that the person should know from the Book of Allah, or should remember from the Book of Allah. And the second verse is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, مَنْ كَفَرَ بِاللَّهِ مِنْ بَعْدِ إِيمَانِهِ إِلَّا مِنْ أُكْرِهَ وَقَلْبُهُ مُطْمَئِنٌ بِالْإِيمَانِ وَلَكِنْ مَنْ شَرَحَ بِالْكُفْرِ صَدَرًا فَعَلَيْهِمْ غَضَبٌ مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَلَهُمْ عَذَابٌ أَلِيمٌ. Or that, the meaning of which is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, whoever disbelieves after having faith, except he who is coerced while his heart is firm with belief, but the punishment or upon him is upon him whose heart opened up to disbelief, so meaning willingly. And that's, as we said, from Surah An-Nahl 106. Then he continues and says, so Allah Ta'ala does not excuse such people except if they were forced into doing something while their hearts were still firm and content with belief. So anyone besides such a person has disbelieved after having faith, regardless of whether he does it out of fear or greed or wanting to please someone, or out of love of his country or family or relatives or money, or even if he does it jokingly or for any other excuse. The only acceptable excuse is the one who was unwillingly forced. And then he says, so the verse proves this in two ways. First, the phrase, إِلَّا مَنْ أُكْرِهِ, or except he who was coerced. So only such a person is excused, because obviously the author is showing that because the exception was made to the coerced one. And then he says, and it is well known that a person can only be forced to do an act or to say something verbally. He cannot be forced to believe with his heart, for no one can coerce another's heart. And then he says, secondly, so the second part of the verse that proves this, he says, the phrase, that was because, so the next verse in 107, ذَلِكَ بِأَنَّهُمْ اسْتَحَبُّوا الْحَيَاةَ الدُّنْيَا وَالْحَيَاةَ الدُّنْيَا عَلَى الْآخِرَةِ. Or that is because they preferred the life of this world over the life of the hereafter. And that's from Surah An-Nahl 107. So he says, so it is clearly mentioned that the reason for their kufr and punishment was not due to any heartfelt belief, or because of ignorance or a hatred of religion, or a love of disbelief. Rather, the reason for their eternal punishment in the hereafter was due to the fact that he achieved some benefit in this world, preferring this benefit over the religion, and Allah knows best. So this is the end of the book. So now just to add some commentary. So as we said, the point of this is to show that actions are needed in order for Îmân, or the religion of the person, to be accepted and for it to be valid. So the author started this section off by, telling us that it's an extremely important, great matter, and the reason for this, to anyone who's been listening to these lessons from before, or anyone who is involved in da'wah to the aqidah of ash-Sunnah wal-Jamâ'ah, obviously would see why. Because the number of people who fall into mistakes with regards to this are a very high number of people, and the issue of Îmân was the first matter of bid'ah that came about in the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which was during the time of at the end of the time of the Sahaba with the Khawârij, and then it started to grow from there, and later on the Murji'ah and so on. So the Shaykh rahimahullah, as well as the scholars of ash-Sunnah wal-Jamâ'ah in his area at that time and elsewhere in the world, were dealing with these matters with regards to people giving false excuses to people who would believe things of disbelief, or make statements of disbelief, or perform actions of disbelief, or shirk. They at the time, they were obviously dealing with this, and this is one of the reasons why the author, as the author said, there's no dispute that Tawheed must be in the heart and on the tongue and in the actions. And that if one of these is absent, then the person would not be Muslim. And this is the aqidah of ash-Sunnah wal-Jamâ'ah, and we've talked about this many times before, that Îmân is belief in the heart, or we can say the actions and statements of the heart, as well as the statements on the tongue and the actions of the body. And Tawheed is part of Îmân in general, so it is a must that each part of Tawheed would contain each part of Îmân. So meaning that just as Îmân needs to be in these three areas, then Tawheed would need to be in these three areas as well. And as the author mentioned, there's no dispute about this. And we talked about this many times before. The number of early scholars that not only said this statement, but stated that it's a matter of consensus, is more than that can really be discussed in one lesson. So it's not a matter of dispute. So this is the Aqeedah of ash-Sunnah wal-Jamâ'ah. If we're talking about the Aqeedah of the Murji'ah, and this is any of the type of Murji'ah, or any group that falls under the banner of the Murji'ah, when we talk about the issues of Îmân and kufr. So this would include the Ash'ariyah or the Ash'aris, the Maturidiyah, the Jahmiyah, the Rafidah, who are the extremist Shia, the Karramiyah, who also would be, so the Maturidis and the Jahmis and the Rafidis and the Karramis, and as well as a number of scholars have included in this, in our time, Jama'at al-Tabligh, as well as what they call al-Asraniyin, which are a type of modernist group. According to these people or these groups, then Tawheed, according to them, is only in the heart. And some of them would say on the tongue as well. So meaning that whatever we all that's held accountable for, all that a person needs to be Muslim is whatever's in their heart. And some of them would add to this what's on the tongue. So meaning that they would state or make the statement La ilaha illallah, and that this would be sufficient for the person to be Muslim. And the vast majority, if not all of these groups, don't include actions in Îmân or Tawheed. And it would include the actions of the heart and the actions of the body. So when we say the actions of the body, this is obvious. Salat, fasting, hajj, giving zakat, performing jihad, giving da'wah, teaching, anything that's on the actions of the body. Actions of the heart are things that take place in the heart that aren't related to belief or what the person's aqeedah or actual belief is. So meaning that the actions of the heart are things like fear, love, hope, desire, all of these types of things, while the statements of the heart are things like ilm and ma'rifah and tasdeeq and yaqeen and things like this. So we're talking about the person, what he believes, his knowledge in his heart of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the religion, as well as his certainty of this. So the things that relate to the person's beliefs can be said that it's the statements of the heart, and the things that relate to how the heart feels and acts in different situations would be the actions of the heart. Next is the Khawârij and the Mu'tazila. So the early groups of the Khawârij and the Mu'tazila, they agreed with ash-Sunnah wal-Jamâ'ah in including actions in Îmân and Tawheed. So they also agreed that in order for a person to be Muslim, they would have to have the beliefs in the heart, or the statements and actions of the heart, as well as the statements on the tongue and the actions of the body. However, they also disputed or differed with ash-Sunnah wal-Jamâ'ah on issues related to this. So, for example, the Khawârij and the Mu'tazila, they considered every single action to be a condition for Îmân. So what does this mean? So ash-Sunnah wal-Jamâ'ah, we say that in general, a person has to have the different things in their hearts, so they need to have the statements and actions of the heart and statements on the tongue and actions of the body. We don't say that if a person didn't do every single thing that was obligatory, that they've left Islam, or that if they didn't state every single thing that was obligatory on them, that they would leave Islam. So we say that each one of these things needs to be present. The person needs to have some actions of the body, some statements of the tongue, some actions of the heart and some statements of the heart. And we say that there's certain things in the heart that need to be present in order for the person to be Muslim. Some might not be present sometimes, and some might be present sometimes, as well as the actions of the body and the statements of the heart. While the Khawârij and the Mu'tazila, they say that every single action of the heart that was obligatory has to exist all the time, otherwise the person isn't Muslim. And likewise with the statements of the tongue, the statements of the heart, the actions of the heart and the actions of the body. So if a person left something that was obligatory, or left a statement that was obligatory, they would leave Islam. If they left an action that was obligatory, they would leave Islam, and so on. So ahl-Sunnah wal-Jamâ'ah and these groups agree in considering these things from Îmân. But ahl-Sunnah wal-Jamâ'ah doesn't consider that every single action needs to be present in order for a person to be Muslim, or that if someone leaves one thing that's obligatory, that they've left Islam, or if they do one thing or two things or a number of things that are haram, that they leave Islam. We don't say this. We say that there's things that can remove a person from Islam if they say them on their tongue or do them with their body or believe them in their heart. Likewise, there's things in these three areas that are required for a person to be Muslim, but there's also ones that aren't required. And this is more of a matter to get into when we talk about the what we call musamma al-Îmân, or the reality of Îmân. So for this part, the takeaway would be that we differentiate between, or we say that statements of the heart and the tongue and actions of the heart and the body need to be present in some way in order for a person to be Muslim. We also say that there's some of each of these things that actually are required for a person to be Muslim. So there might be certain beliefs that a person has to have in order to be Muslim. So for example, if someone doesn't believe that Allah exists, we would say obviously they're not Muslim. If someone doesn't know a specific detail that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us in the Quran about himself, for example, a person doesn't know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as the Prophet ﷺ mentioned in the Sunnah, doesn't know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala descends in the last third of the night. This wouldn't be required for the person to be Muslim, as long as if we knew that, or if he heard of it and it was proven to him, he accepted it. But for example, someone isn't even Muslim if they don't believe Allah exists. So we say that each of the actions of the heart and the body, the statements of the heart and the tongue, are at different levels as well. So this is another matter from the Aqeedah of ahl-Sunnah wal-Jamâ'ah, that we differentiate, or we say that each thing has different levels. So some things are a requirement for the person to be Muslim. If they didn't have them, they wouldn't be Muslim. Other things aren't a requirement to be Muslim, but they're obligatory. So if a person didn't do them, they would be sinful, but they wouldn't leave Islam. And then lastly, there are things that aren't even obligatory, but they're recommended. So if a person didn't do them, they wouldn't leave Islam and they wouldn't be sinful, but they would have lost the opportunity to gain those rewards. And likewise when it comes to bad deeds. So there's certain beliefs or actions or statements that a person can do or say or believe that would remove the person from Islam. There's also other things where if they did these, any of the three, they wouldn't leave Islam, but they'd be sinful. And then lastly, there's other things where if they did them, they wouldn't leave Islam and they wouldn't even be sinful, but they would have lost the opportunity to gain the reward by abandoning those things. So we don't say that Îmân is all one thing, it's either present or absent. We say it's at different levels, and it can increase and it can decrease, and it's at different parts of the body. So this is just a very quick explanation of the matters of Îmân according to ahl-Sunnah wal-Jamâ'ah, as well as the Khawârij and the Murji'ah. So the author's point here is that each part of these things on the body, or from the body, so the heart, the tongue, and the actions, or the outward actions of the body, need to be present in order for the person to be upon Tawheed, or to be considered a Muslim. So if either of these are gone, whether it's just one of them or two of them or three of them, the point is that all three need to be present. If any of them are gone, then the person wouldn't be Muslim. So if we look at what the author said, we see that he mentioned that there's 3 types of Tawheed. One in the heart, and this is the greatest type of it, and it's the basis for everything. And it's impossible that anyone could be compelled or coerced with regards to anything like this, or that there would be some sort of excuse given for someone in not having Tawheed in their heart, because no one can force you to do otherwise, or fear can't actually make you stop believing in your heart. So this wouldn't be something that would be excused. And equal to this is the different types of things that would happen in the heart. So if a person, with regards to, like we talked about the actions and the statements of the heart, so the statements are things like knowledge and acceptance and belief, and certainty and things like this that relate to actual beliefs. And then the actions of the heart are love and hate and fear and tawakkul, and sincerity and things like this. The second thing is obviously, like we talked about, is Tawheed on the tongue, and that's saying La ilaha illallah, and no one would be given an excuse for not doing this, except for the person who is physically unable to do so, because they can't actually speak, or the person who is forced or prevented from doing so for whatever reason, with an acceptable type of coercion. And things that would fall under Tawheed on the tongue as well would be calling to Tawheed and clarifying the shirk, or clarifying shirk if it's being seen and people are unaware of it, as well as the insulting shirk and its people, and declaring the non-Muslims to be non-Muslims, and declaring someone who's a taghut to be a taghut, and so on. And the last of these sections is the Tawheed on the body, and this is acting upon La ilaha illallah. For example, seeking help from Allah alone, slaughtering for Allah or sacrificing for Allah alone, performing the salat for Allah alone, and any of the other actions of Tawheed. And then, based on these types of, or where Tawheed would take place and where Îmân would take place, the author mentioned different groups or different categories that people would fall into. So the first that he mentioned is a person who knows Tawheed but doesn't act upon it. So he brings the statement of La ilaha illallah, so he says La ilaha illallah, and he may believe in his heart, and he knows about Allah, but he doesn't act upon it on his body. Or even better to say would be that the person who knows it in their heart and believes it in their heart but doesn't act upon it outwardly, so they don't even say La ilaha illallah. So they don't attest to the shahada, or they don't act upon anything from that. And this is what the author referred to when he talked about Iblis and Fir'aun and their likes. So the person who knows it inwardly, or even believes it inwardly, but they don't act upon it or say anything about it outwardly, would fall under this category. And this is the type that the author focused mostly on, because it's less likely for you to know about someone acting upon Islam and not believing in it. This would require some strong evidence to show that they actually don't believe it in their heart. But mostly what we would deal with would be people who know about it, or maybe even attest to it, but never act upon it, or they act contrary to it by performing shirk and so on. And this is the second type that the author mentioned, and that's the person who acts upon Tawheed, but doesn't understand it or doesn't believe it in his heart. So outwardly, you would see him as a Muslim, but inwardly there would be kufr and shirk and hypocrisy and these types of things. And this is what the hypocrite or the munafiq is. And as the author mentioned, that they're worse than the regular kafir, or the plain kafir. And the reason for this is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, إِنَّ الْمُنَافِقِينَ فِي الدَّرْكِ الْأَسْفَلِ مِنَ النَّارِ, or in that indeed the hypocrites are in the lowest depths of the fire. And the reason for this is because they outwardly claim to be Muslim, to receive the benefits of this in the dunya, and they try to fool the Muslimin and some of them might believe that they're fooling Allah. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, يُخَادِعُونَ اللَّهَ وَهُوَ خَادِعُهُمْ, or that they try to fool Allah, but Allah is fooling them, and so on. So these are some of the reasons why the munafiq would be worse. And also we can also theoretically or even practically see that there would be a third type of person that the author didn't mention, but that's the person who doesn't have any Islam or Îmân or Tawheed inwardly or outwardly. So they don't believe in it in their heart, and they don't fear Allah, and they don't love Allah, and so on, and they never act upon it. So they don't say the Shahada, and they don't perform the Salat or anything else. And so just to go back to the first category, because that's what the author focuses on mostly in this book, as well as the majority of his books, and even really the majority of the people who have spoken about Tawheed, because that's the actual one that Muslimin would encounter, or this type of person. So we can say that this category could be divided into two types as well. The first would be someone who isn't excused in the way that they leave their acting upon Tawheed. So the person doesn't act upon Tawheed in whatever way, and they're not excused for it. The second would be someone who is excused. And as we'll get into, this is someone who is coerced or compelled or forced. And then we'll talk about what's acceptable in that category and what isn't. So the first, someone who isn't excused, the author did talk about this, and that's why we're talking about it. So this is the person who leaves Tawheed or doesn't act upon Tawheed, and it's out of stubbornness or out of pride or something like this. The second, or there's another type of person who would fall under this category, another group of people that would fall under this category, are the people who have left Tawheed and acted upon shirk, and they don't have an acceptable excuse. So meaning they don't have an acceptable misconception where we would say it's acceptable that the person actually was confused by this, as opposed to someone who does something and isn't actually convinced by what they're saying. And the author referred to this when he said that it's not possible for the people of our area or the people of our country and those who comply with them or those who do things like them. And the author spent time on this type because this is the majority of what he would encounter and what we would encounter as well. So it's unlikely, or it's not very common that we would encounter people acting in a way that contradicts Tawheed when they know that it's wrong, but they're just refusing to do so, like in a similar manner, like Fir'aun and Iblis and it's more likely that you would find someone who would act upon shirk or leave Tawheed, and they would bring some sort of false excuse. So they would actually think that this excuses them. They might bring an ayah to try to prove what they're saying, or a hadith to try to prove what they're saying, or make a claim about the Sahaba to try to prove what they're saying, to prove that it's actually right. As opposed to Fir'aun and Iblis, they knew that they were wrong, but they did so, or they refused to follow the truth that came to them or that they knew of, and this was out of pride or out of stubbornness. So some of the examples that the author, or some of the false arguments or false excuses that the author refers to, one of them is that the person leaves Tawheed or they act upon shirk out of fear that they will lose something from their dunya. So they'll lose a job, or they'll lose some of their wealth, or they'll lose part of their status, or something like this. So this is the first thing that the author referred to. And an example of this as well could be that if a person knew that you were upon Tawheed, that they wouldn't buy from your store or from your business, or they wouldn't sell things to you for whatever you need, or they wouldn't help you out if you were poor, or they wouldn't lend you money if they knew you were in need of a loan. And this is the type of thing that would refer, or that would fall under this category. And other things, when he says, so he refers to a loss of dunya as well as a loss of wealth. So here we can say that the loss of wealth is a type of loss of dunya, and that the loss of something in the dunya could be even more general. So for example, that the person might lose their wife or their husband, or they might be refused to marry someone, that that person wouldn't accept to marry them, or the parents wouldn't accept for that person to marry them because of their deen, and so on. Another example that the author gives of a false argument is, or a false excuse, is that the person would do something from shirk or leave something of their Tawheed that's required for Islam out of the claim that they're trying to please, or they're trying to get near to, or whatever you want to call it, like suck up or anything like this to the disbelievers. And obviously this isn't an excuse because there's no evidence for it. So the claim that we're going to do something of kufr or leave something of Tawheed as a means to please someone else from the mushrikeen is obviously a false argument. Another example that the author gives is the person not acting upon Tawheed or performing shirk, and that the reason for this would be due to his love or his desire for his own country, and this could be his own province, or it could be his own state, or his own country, or city, or anything like this. And this would become this way if he was in an area that was full of shirk and kufr, and he feared that if he rejected it, or rebuked it, or made inkar on it, that he would have to leave that country, because the people wouldn't accept him to be there, or that he might have to, he wouldn't be able to stay in the place that he loves, and he would have to go to somewhere that is less beloved to him. So this is this is what the author is referring to when he mentions like this, or he mentions this. The next, which is the fifth false excuse that the author refers to, is if the person leaves Tawheed or acts upon shirk out of love for his people, or his family, or his tribe, which is, can be similar to the land or his country as well, in the sense that it's his love for something, and that this would end up leading him to leave acting upon Tawheed, whether it's by him leaving the salat, or not rejecting or rebuking something upon them when they're doing open shirk, and so on, and not declaring his disavowal from it, and the likes. And other examples of this that that we would see today that maybe weren't around in the time of the author would be examples of people going into parliaments where shirk is performed, and they might say that it's because it's part of their job, or something like this, or they want to make the money, or they would like to they like the status and things like this, or they might say, we want to help our country or bring our country together and things like this, but at the same time that this job requires them to do things that contradict Islam, from legislating laws that contradict Islam, or rejecting laws that follow Islam, or working in a way that works against the da'wah and the jihad of the Muslimin, and so on. So this would be this is one of the modern day or contemporary examples that some of the scholars have mentioned that would fall under this category. And the author proved his point that these are false arguments by mentioning people who disbelieved, performed actions of shirk or kufr, and they had brought up these false arguments, or these false excuses, and that these excuses weren't accepted from them, and they weren't taken into account, and these people were held accountable for their actions or their statements. So one of the things that he mentioned was the story of the people in the time of the Prophet ﷺ who mocked the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. And we talked about this a number of times before in Surah At-Tawbah, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned their story. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, "La ta'tadhiru qad kafartum ba'da imanikum," or do not give an excuse. Indeed, you have disbelieved after your iman. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, despite the fact that they said we were only joking and so on, He didn't give them an excuse. And there's other evidences that we can mention as well, like when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, قُلْ إِنْ كَانَ آبَاؤُكُمْ وَأَبْنَاؤُكُمْ وَإِخْوَانُكُمْ وأزواجكم وعشيرتكم وأموال اقترفتموها وتجارة تخشون كسادها ومساكن ترضونها أحب إليكم من الله ورسوله وجهاد في سبيله فتربصوا حتى يأتي الله بأمره والله لا يهدي القوم الفاسقين. Or when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in Surah At-Tawbah, verse 24, say, if your fathers and your sons and your brothers and your wives and your tribes and wealth which you have gained and matters of sales or matters of business transactions that you fear will fall apart or that you'll lose, and areas of dwelling which you are pleased with or satisfied with, are more beloved to you than Allah and His Messenger and jihad in His path, then sit and wait until Allah brings a matter from Him, or that He brings His command or His matter, and Allah does not guide a people who are transgressors. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that all of these things, or the giving these false excuses about any of these things, which is love for anyone in your family or your tribe or your wealth or your business or your homes, meaning like your places of dwelling or your countries or whatever it may be, that all of these things would be considered false arguments. And another point that would fall under this issue as well, that some scholars or some contemporary scholars have mentioned, is that just as all of these false arguments or these false excuses that are given by individuals, likewise these false arguments or false excuses can be given by larger groups of people or even countries or even leaders of countries and so on. So what some of the scholars have mentioned is that certain organizations or certain states or countries or whatever, these large entities might be, won't follow the Sharia in the way that they need to follow it. So if it's a country, they might not rule with the Sharia, or they might not perform the things that need to be performed, or they might perform things that shouldn't be performed and that would contradict Tawheed. And then they would give essentially the same arguments that the individual would give that we just talked about. So they might say that if we were to implement the Sharia, then we wouldn't receive full support from our people, and that we would be called to step down, or that we wouldn't receive international support, whether it be military support or whether it's things like financial support, or even just support by means of support in words, these types of things. Or we might be put on the sidelines, or we might be marginalized as a country or as a state, and so on. All of these things would fall exactly under what the individual person would give as an excuse. Or they might say, well, we've always been ruling with things that go with our culture, so we can't start implementing the Sharia because this would get rid of some of the things in our culture, whatever it may be, whether it's matters of shirk or matters that are less than shirk. But in any case, just as these excuses wouldn't apply to an individual, they also wouldn't apply to larger groups of people, whether they're organized or not organized. just as we just talked about the first type of person, which is the one who wouldn't be excused, there's also a second category of people who would be excused. So they would be excused by leaving something that's required for Tawheed, or performing something that might nullify Tawheed. And the condition for this to be accepted is that their heart remains pure, so they haven't accepted these things of kufr or shirk in their heart, and they've continued to believe and contain or hold on to the requirements of Tawheed in their heart, but that there was something outward that forced them to perform or to leave something that was required, to perform something that would nullify, or to leave something that was required. And due to this is when the author said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't give an excuse to anyone except the ones who were compelled or coerced while their heart was tranquil with Îmân. And obviously this is based on the verse that we talked about, مَنْ كَفَرَ بِاللَّهِ مِنْ بَعْدِ إِيمَانِهِ إِلَّا مَنْ أُكْرِهَ وَقَلْبُهُ مُطْمَئِنٌ بِالْإِيمَانِ, or that whosoever disbelieves in Allah after his faith, except for those who are compelled while their hearts, or while his heart is tranquil or calm with Îmân. And the author didn't go into what are the types of things that would lead to compulsion or coercion, and he didn't go into the different types of compulsion or coercion and what would actually be acceptable, not acceptable. However, we can go into that for a little bit just to give a better idea. So we can say that when the scholars talk about compulsion or coercion, they divide it into two different. So the first type is what we call al-ikrah al-mulji', and this is what the author referred to when he said that it's a type that the person performing it would be excused. And al-ikrah al-mulji' is al-ikrah is compulsion or coercion, and al-mulji' or mulji' relates to refuge. So meaning that it's something that the person sought refuge in, this compulsion to stop something, or it was something that did give him refuge from leaving Islam, in the sense that it was an acceptable type of coercion or compulsion. And the likes of this, or some examples of this, is someone who, for example, is given or threatened with death or threatened with execution, in the sense that if he acted upon Tawheed, then he would be killed. And in this, the situation would be, or the condition would be, that the person who's making the threat is able to do so. So, for example, if someone was kidnapped and was being threatened, and the weapons were in front of him, and the person doing the threatening, was well known to follow through with his threats, or the person was quite sure that if he didn't do what the person said, that he would be executed, then this would be considered an excuse. While on the other hand, if someone who has no physical power and has no say in their society and has no means of enforcing anything, and they're just a person on the street who's very weak, and they said, if you don't leave Islam, then I'm going to kill you, and there was no threat whatsoever, even though verbally a threat was given, this wouldn't be an excuse. And this is obvious to anyone who looks at the topic, with justice. Another example of this is beating or torture that would lead to injuries or severe pain, and the person isn't able to withstand it. They can't leave, they can't do something to get away, and at the same time they don't feel that they would be able to take it, and that it would have a very harsh effect on them. Again, with the condition that, for example, that the person is able to do that. So if it's someone who physically wouldn't be able to hurt you, or they might be able to hurt you, but there's people around you to protect you, and so on, then this wouldn't be considered an excuse. As opposed to a small type of beating where the person might receive a cut, or they might, break a finger or something like this, then most scholars, if not all of them, considered these things to be unacceptable because there's no long-term harm. Other examples that the scholars have given is the threat of prison or actual prison. So, for example, if it was 1 day or 2 or 3 days as opposed to life in prison, then life in prison would obviously be something that would be considered an excuse, or even long-term, like 10 or 15 years, or if the person felt that they couldn't handle it, as opposed to sitting in a cell for a couple hours or a day or overnight and these types of things, then this wouldn't be considered an excuse. The next type of ikrah is al-ikrah ghayr al-mulji', or ikrah that isn't mulji', so that it doesn't fall into or doesn't have the conditions that need to be met for this first type. And things like that would be someone who, for example, is threatened to be killed, that's threatened to be beaten, or even they are beaten, but with something that doesn't hurt, or that's something that really, it might sting, but there's no real harm behind it, or someone who's threatened with a fine of $50 or something like this, while they're quite well off, and $50 isn't going to affect them, or that they're threatened with a night in prison. Things like this wouldn't be considered an excuse, because there is no actual coercion being taken place here. Rather, it's just either empty threats or threats that don't actually have an effect on the person's well-being. Other things that don't fall into this, are things like someone being embarrassed, or someone being spoken about in a poor manner, or someone being considered an extremist, or being called certain names like Khawârij or Takfiri or Wahhabi or anything like this, because in reality a name call isn't a reason to leave something of Tawheed or to perform something of shirk. So if someone says my family will think bad of me, or they'll call me an extremist, so I'm not going to pray, or I'm going to take part in matters of shirk that they have, whether it's celebrating their democracy or things like this, none of these things would be considered valid excuses. And rather, it's from the shaitan, and it's from the plans of the shaitan, or the plot of the shaitan, as a means to try to scare the people of Tawheed. And this is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, إِنَّمَا ذَلِكُمُ الشَّيْطَانُ يُخَوِّفُ أَوْلِيَاءَهُ فَلَا تَخَافُوهُمْ وَخَافُونِ إِن كُنْتُم مُؤْمِنِينَ. Or that in Surah Ali Imran, verse 175, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, indeed, that is only the shaitan who is trying to fear, or who is scaring his allies, so do not fear them and fear me if indeed you are believers. So we know that just the fear of something, or minor harms or minor annoyances and things like this, they're not considered actual acceptable means of coercion. And an example of this, even though the hadith is weak, has a slight weakness in the chain. Some have accepted the hadith, but as we said, Allahu Alam, the stronger opinion is that it's a slightly weak hadith. That was narrated by Imam Ahmad and Ibn Majah, that the Prophet ﷺ, it's attributed to him that he said that Allah will say to a slave on the Day of Judgment who saw something that was evil or something that was wrong, but he did not rebuke it or stop it or try to stop it, that Allah will say, what prevented you from rebuking or making inkar upon that? So the slave will say, fear of the people. So Allah will say, I was more deserving of being feared. That it's attributed to the Prophet ﷺ that he said, لا يحقر أحدكم نفسه. قالوا يا رسول الله كيف يحقر أحدنا نفسه؟ قال يرى أمرا لله عليه فيه مقال ثم لا يقول فيه فيقول الله عز وجل له يوم القيامة ما منعك أن تقول في كذا وكذا؟ فيقول خشية الناس فيقول فإياي كنت أحق أن تخشى. And again, we said this is a weak hadith. there's the narrator of the hadith is Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, and the narrator from him is Abu al-Bakhtari, but he didn't actually meet him, so there's a break in that chain. However, obviously the meaning, or the general meaning of the hadith, which is the obligation of rebuking or censoring or making inkar upon something when you see it as being wrong, is well known in evidences from the Quran and the Sunnah, and just the general rules of Islam. So here, a few things that remain is a threat sufficient for the person to follow through with the leaving of something of Tawheed or performing shirk, or does they actually have to be afflicted before they can follow through with it? So meaning that, and this is a matter that there's a difference of opinion upon amongst the scholars. So some say that the being threatened is sufficient. So some of the scholars, and they're the majority, they say that it's sufficient to have a verbal threat, with the condition that the person who's making the threat is able to implement whatever they're threatening. So if the person threatens to kill or execute, or they threaten to torture, they threaten to rape, or they threaten to whatever the threat is, if they're able to follow through on that, then this would be considered sufficient. And they use the generality of the verse when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, except those who are compelled or coerced and their heart is tranquil with Îmân. The second opinion is that it's necessary for them to actually be afflicted by something before they can actually follow through with this. And this was narrated from Imam Ahmad, and as we know, or as many know, the story in which Imam Ahmad was tortured by the rulers at the time to say, or to try to get him to say that the Quran was created, but he refused to, and other scholars at the time followed through with this. When they were threatened to be beaten, they followed through with this, and they said that the Quran was created. And Imam Ahmad made inkar on them, and some of them he refused to speak to for the rest of their lives. And from amongst them was the Imam Yahya ibn Ma'in, and actually the vast majority of the scholars at the time. And what Imam Ahmad at the time, for those who don't know the story, was the scholars at the time used the hadith of Ammar. So Ammar ibn Yasir, the well-known story where the kuffar of Quraysh were torturing him, and Ammar said some statements of kufr, and he came to the Prophet ﷺ and mentioned what he had done, and then the Prophet ﷺ asked him about how his heart, what state he found his heart in, and he said it was calm or tranquil with Îmân. So he said, if they return to that, then return to what you had done. So Imam Ahmad, in this situation, he said, they used the hadith of Ammar, but Ammar was actually tortured, while those ones say, or it was said to them, we will torture you. So Imam Ahmad was of the view that a mere threat in this situation wouldn't be sufficient, because how can you use a hadith in which a Sahabi was actually tortured and say that this now gives the excuse of anyone who isn't even tortured yet to follow through with whatever they're being asked to do? However, there's different ways of reconciling. So some say that if the threat is with death, then obviously you can't wait for it to happen, because once it happens, there's no turning back. But if it's other things like imprisonment or torture and these types of things, then you would have to wait for it to happen. So this is one way that some scholars have reconciled between the evidences. Other ways is that they differentiate between who is being forced to do something. So if the person is from the scholars or the major students of knowledge, or he's a person who the people follow and look up to, that if he followed through with this, it would have a major effect on the Muslimin, then this person would actually have to be tortured first, or wouldn't even be able to, or wouldn't be allowed to even give in. While if the person was someone who their statements don't have a major effect on the Muslimin, and by them following through with it, it wouldn't have a major effect, then that this person, that being threatened would be sufficient, and they wouldn't actually have to go through any sort of major affliction. And in any case, the scholars say that holding steadfast upon what you're on is better, even if it leads to death. And they give examples of the Sahaba who refused to give in, and what the Sahaba went through. Another issue to bring up with regards to ikrah or compulsion is that it's an excuse only when it refers to you yourself. But if you are compelled or being compelled to do something to someone else, then it would no longer be an excuse for you. So for example, if a person said, I was compelled or coerced into swearing at the Prophet ﷺ, this would be acceptable for him to accept the rukhsa or the concession to follow through with that statement, even though it would be better not to. But it would be acceptable with the conditions that we talked about before, that the person who's doing the threat is able to follow through with it, and it's something that would actually have a major effect on the person, and so on. But if it's something that carries over to someone else, for example, you're being threatened or coerced to kill a Muslim, or to rape a Muslim, or to severely beat a Muslim, or anything like this, then in this situation, it wouldn't be considered an excuse for the person who's doing it, or the person who's using it as an excuse. And the scholars have spoken about this. The reason why is because if you're being threatened to be killed, if you don't kill someone else, then you don't have the right, you're not at a higher state to kill someone else in your place, or your blood isn't more protected than the person who you're going to kill, and your blood isn't, or that person's blood isn't at a lower level than your blood, or your life isn't at a higher level than their life. So for you to put someone else's life in place of yours would not be allowed, because you can't make that decision on behalf of that person, it's not the time to go into the evidences and the statements of the scholars for this right now, but in general that would be the rule. So just to sum up, we can say that, we can finish by talking about what is, or where can compulsion actually take place, or what are the situations in which a person might claim compulsion. So the first would be performing a statement, performing an action of shirk or kufr. For example, making sujood to other than Allah, or sacrificing for other than Allah, and so on. The second would be statements on the tongue, such as swearing at the Prophet ﷺ, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or the religion, or anything like this. And then the third would be the actions of the heart. So if we talk about the actions of the body, then it's possible and it's acceptable that a person that the person would fall into something, an action of kufr, due to this compulsion, and that would be similar to what we talked about before, which is the different types of things that, if the person says that if you don't do this, we're gonna kill you, or they beat him until he's in pain and he can't take it anymore, and then so he says a statement of kufr. So this is the first thing, which would be the harm from your action doesn't transgress over to anybody else, and this is what we talked about as before. The second type would be what we talked about as well, that it does carry over to someone else. So you're harming someone else at this point. And this obviously wouldn't be allowed, and we talked about this already. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said about the angels when they will take the souls, or they took the souls of certain people, that they said, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, قَالُوا فِيمَ كُنْتُمْ قَالُوا كُنَّا مُسْتَضْعَفِينَ فِي الْأَرْضِ قالوا ألم تكن أرض الله واسعة فتهاجروا فيها فأولئك مأواهم جهنم. Or in Surah An-Nisa, verse 97, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that they will say, or they said, meaning the angels, what were you in, or what state were you in they said, we were weak and oppressed in the land. So the people said that. Then he says, they said, so the angels, was not the land of Allah widespread, or wasn't it wide open, so that you would make hijrah or emigrate therein? Indeed, those people's destination is Jahannam. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed this verse concerning Muslimin who did not emigrate from Mecca to Medina with the Muslimin, and they remained in Mecca. And then the kuffar of Mecca, when they went out to fight the Muslimin in the Battle of Badr, this verse came down about them, in that they weren't considered excused in going out and fighting against the Muslimin, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give you an excuse if you were forced, if you had no way around it, as well as if the thing that you were doing wasn't hurting any other Muslim. But if you had a way around it and refused to, or you did something where it was a transgression against another Muslim, then obviously this wouldn't be excused. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَلَا تَعْتَدُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُعْتَدِينَ, and do not transgress. Indeed, Allah does not love the transgressors, and that's from Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 190, and then other evidences from the Quran and Sunnah that can be talked about at another time. If we're talking about the ikrah on statements, then this also falls exactly under the ikrah, or the compulsion, when it comes to actions, because it's outward, it doesn't relate to belief, and also it doesn't, some of the evidences were revealed or came down, like the hadith of Ammar is related to statements and it's not related to actions. So everything that we said about actions being excused or not being excused due to compulsion, then it would apply as well to statements of the tongue. And the last thing is the actions of the heart, or the things that take place in the heart. This is something that it's not possible for compulsion to affect. So for example, if someone said, we're going to kill you if you don't hate the Prophet ﷺ, there's no way for this to be tested, or there's no way for you to prove in your heart that, or to prove to people that in your heart you hate the Prophet ﷺ, and there's no real way for a person to do anything to change that. As opposed to a statement, you could say the statement and it might make them stop whatever they're doing, and it might not make them stop, but it's something that's visible, and it's something that you have control over. You can control what you say, and you can control what you do. As for the things that take place in the heart, then it's not possible to have compulsion over it. And this is when the author said, as for the beliefs of the heart, then no one is compelled or coerced with regards to that. So with this, we would have finished the explanation or commentary on the book Kashf ash-Shubuhât by Muhammad ibn Abdil-Wahhab. And inshallah, those who heard it all or partially have benefited from it, so this them. Wallahu a'lam.